The legal battle to fight the Expropriation Act is being fought in the Cape High Court this week. In attendance is Kallie Kriel, the CEO of AfriForum. Welcome, Kallie.
Good morning to you, Chris. Great speaking to you.
What was the first day in court like?
Well, one would never know. I think the arguments we raised were very strong in terms of showing that the Expropriation Act is indeed unconstitutional. Of course, this court case is set down for 5 days until Friday. We are continuing with our case this morning to argue. Then after us, it would be the IRR legal. And then, of course, the various amici that support our case will have the chance. And then all the other parties that oppose our application. And in the end, we can then have an opportunity to reply. So it's still a long way to go, but it's worthwhile because it's a good cause we're fighting for.
Kallie, the Democratic Alliance and Vaderland Stichting, they have a separate application being heard alongside. What's the difference between the two applications?
Yes, what happened is we made a court application to the Pretoria High Court. The DA came to the Western Cape High Court, or to Cape Town, and then there was a proposition or a proposal that these cases should rather be joined in the same courtroom because there is some overlap with that. And that is why we then agreed to come to Cape Town. There is an overlap, but there's also a difference. In terms of the DA's case, they argue that the various provinces did not give a mandate for their provinces to vote in the National Council of Provinces, then thus making the whole act invalid. But then they also focus specifically on Section 19.2 that allows expropriation to take place, and you can also then only then after go to court. I'll come to the implications of that. We also focus on Section 9.2, also Section 9.8 that says expropriation can continue even when you appeal a judgment in the court. But I think the difference in the cases are that we focus specifically also on Section 12.3 and 4. Those are the sections that allows for expropriation without compensation. And our argument is there. If you're going to look at Section 25 of the Constitution, it strikes a balance between various factors that have to be taken into account. What this act does, it actually breaks what the intention is of the Constitution, and it diverts and gives some higher status to so-called null compensation or compensation with expropriation without compensation, while the Constitution says that there should be just an equitable compensation. But what is the implications of this act? One should measure an act not only in terms of its intentions. Well, we believe in this case there are extremely bad intentions. Deputy President Moshatile stated it quite clearly that they want to expropriate without compensation. But what are the implications for landowners and property owners, but also all the people in the country? Let's start off with all the people in the country. If you look and this is not new news, that is why it's so astonishing that the ANC does not learn from this. When you have the slightest implication or send the slightest signal that you don't respect property rights, it has a detrimental effect on the country's economy. This is not just a slight indication. It states quite clearly that there would be infringement of property rights without compensation. And we can look at what happened in Zimbabwe. We can look what happened in Venezuela. You have hyperinflation, growing unemployment, growing poverty levels to such an extent that people are fleeing over the borders from Zimbabwe to South Africa. And the same arguments that we hear now from the ANC and the EFF and MK was used there. It was so called to give land to the landless and the poor. What happened? It was elite enrichment, like we see with BEE. It was land and farms for friends and party loyalists, while ordinary people, suffered because of that. That is the economic implications, and that's why we believe it's disloyal to the country to try and promote such an act. With regard to the implications on a specific landowner, um, what happens, remember there are now over 400 expropriation authorities that they call them. That includes municipalities that has the power to expropriate. After a municipal election, we will most probably have a number of municipalities under MK control, for instance. Then they can use that Section 12(3) to expropriate without compensation. Now, the critics would say, but there are specific cases mentioned, 4 of them, where expropriation can take place without compensation. And they say, well, that is narrow enough not to be worried. Well, we don't agree with. There are also big problems with some of those 4 mentioned. But if you go and read the, let's say, the small print, well, it's actually printed quite big. It says expropriation and without compensation can take place in the following, including but not limited to the following. So it's an open-ended situation. So what you can have, an MK municipality can say, well, there can also be other reasons. They can use a reason that's not valid, and they can go ahead. But people would then say, well, if you go to court, then you will win. But the problem is expropriation can take place in Section 19(2) before going to court. So what is the implication for the normal person? You will lose your land. For most people, land is their sole income, and they lose their income because they lose their property. Now they have to go and fight it with their own money against the state that uses our money as taxpayers. And we know, for instance, in Pretoria, if you've got a disputed case, it would take you 3 years to get a court date, and then the case only starts. So now a person will have to fight against the state, even for 5 years with their own money, and hope for the best. That is a serious infringement on property rights.
So this court action is the only thing that stands between that scenario that you have just sketched and protection of properties.
Yes, and that is why this is important. That is why we've got a senior legal team representing us. And that is why we will use the resources we have to fight this till the bitter end. We don't foresee that this fight will be over soon. When there's a judgment in this case, irrespective of what the judgment would be, if it's in favor of the president and the state, we will most definitely appeal this to the appeal court. If it's in our favor, you will have the number of respondents, I believe, that would appeal. So this, and then only after that, it will then go to the Constitutional Court. So we in for a long battle, but some things in life are worth fighting for, and I think property rights is such a thing that's worth fighting for, and using a lot of resources. That is what we have to do, but it's our job, and that is what our members support us for, to take on these kind of fights.
Healthcare matters, but what matters most?
Having cover for the people who keep this business going.
Bonitas is there for you when it counts. Bonitas, medical aid for South Africa. Visit bonitas.co.za and find your plan.
Now, Kallie, should you go through all these court battles that might still have to take place and you succeed, how do you plan to deal with unlawful expropriation?
Yes, maybe I can just still mention, I didn't mention it, we want Section 12(3) and 12(4) simply struck. It's not a central part of the Act, so it doesn't have to be rewritten. The same with Section 19(8). I think in terms of Section 19(2), if it's not struck from the Act, the wording should change. It should change, and it should be referred back to Parliament. In terms of unlawful occupation, well, that's happening at the moment. What you have in many cases, and we have many examples where the police simply don't act. Now landowners have to go to court, and they win these cases. But then they have to make sure that the people that are illegally there have to be removed. And I remember in one case, we supported the Dr. Maseremule in the north of Pretoria, whose land was occupied. We won that case. The people had to be removed, but the red ants, it was a few 100,000 rand because it's a costly thing. So I don't blame them. So you will have to spend hundreds and hundreds of thousands of rands to simply make sure that you get your land back while the state sits back. This happens because they are not doing their job. So I think what we should do is, we will be looking for a case such as that where you hold government accountable or the state accountable for losses that is being incurred. On the legal level, of course, what do you have? You have politicians that urges people to unlawfully occupy land. Julius Malema has done so. A few years back, we got a court order successfully against him that he is not allowed to do that. He had to pay our costs. But you will see that during the last week, he did it again. We have not announced that publicly, so you hear it the first time. But our legal team is drawing up a case at the moment because his behavior is contempt of court. So we believe we have a strong case there. So we have to fight that, and I think that's a broader thing. Fortunately, there are also other civil societies organizations that believes in the free market, that believes in property rights. And I think I want to ask people, if you don't necessarily want to support AfriForum, support those institutions, that we make sure that these organizations have the resources to take these kind of things to court. Because a normal landowner will simply not have the money to protect their property rights.
Kallie, now, this action does not mean in any way that you are against land reform. How would you see land reform constituted?
Well, I think in the first place, last night I was in a debate with Carl Niehaus, and they make all these kind of sweeping statements that all land is stolen and it has to be given back. Given back to whom? The Khoisan people were here first. When are you going to decide what the cut-off date was? Then they also use the fallacy that is being used quite a lot, that 70% of the land in South Africa is owned by white people. But what they don't tell you, that study that was made only looked at 30% of the land in the country. It excluded trusts, such as the Pala Pala farm, which is in a trust. That was not counted as black-owned land. It excluded traditional areas. It excluded state land. So if they say 70%, it's 70% of what? 70% of 30% of the land. That brings you to about 22 or 21% of land owned by individual white commercial farmers. And then, of course, a large portion of that is in the Karoo, where you have to have large parts of land to be able to make a living. So that is specifically the facts. But of course, AfriForum supports the fact we cannot deny that there were forced removals by people of people from land, and in those cases, there should be a restitution. I think that would only be fair. So there's no quarrel that those things can be done. That's why we have a Restitution Act that can indeed identify those cases. Carl Niehaus' sweeping statements won't work there because you have to show what the facts are. And then there can be restitution. In terms of what happened, 94% of people that were successful with these land claims preferred the money. So then you don't change the demographics of land ownership, but restitution has been done. Then, okay, let's say, why didn't the rest work? And we don't have to speculate. In 2017, there was a high-level panel led by former President Kgalema Motlanthe that had to investigate why land reform was not working. And he did not say, they did not find that there's a problem with the acts, anything. What they found was corruption was the problem, lack of capacity was the problem, incompetence was the problem. So now you have, and that we've seen with cadre deployment across the civil service, also with regard then to land reform. So you have a government, ANC-led government, that has failed dismally. They don't want to recognize or acknowledge that they are the problem. Now they have to say, the willing buyer, willing seller system does not work. It does work. There's 77% of land you can see is in the market at any given stage. So if the ANC's cadres steal less and they appoint people that can handle this, that will be the way to go. Now they say, well, no, we have to do something else. It's like hitting your head against the wall. If it hurts, you cannot say, well, I'm just going to hit it harder. It will become better after a time. You can, what the Expropriation Act is, it will simply bring more of the wrong thing, which would be devastating to the country.
Thank you. That was AfriForum CEO Kallie Kriel speaking to Biz News. I'm Chris Steyn. Thank you, Kallie.
Thank you so much, Chris. Great speaking to you.
Start your day a step ahead. Biz News Insider. It delivers the business stories that matter every morning straight to your inbox, sharp, fast, and free. Subscribe now.